Awesome.
Oh, word, much better.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Take it away.
All right, awesome. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk all about food justice. I'm Chantel, and my co-host today is going to be DK. And we also have Laura here that's going to be screen sharing for us. And Lila, do you want to introduce your team?
Sure. Yep. My name's Lila. I am with NYC Parks GreenThumb, their youth engagement coordinator. So helping to support the work that you're doing at Frank White Memorial Garden, as well as almost 10 other gardens that are hosting youth leadership councils around the city. And I'm joined by two AmeriCorps members, Janaya and Ari Batu, that joined just this past month. I've been with GreenThumb almost a year, and we're super excited to have GrowNYC facilitating this workshop today.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, let's just go straight through it to the next slide. You know, we are GrowNYC. We protect the environment, create green spaces, help people stay healthy, and give them the opportunity to make a positive impact. There's Lila looking great in the forest. And if you want to reach out to us, we'll also like share the slides so you guys can connect with her directly. Next slide. Here's also some information for Brotherhood Sister Soul for folks who are not from BroSis and are joining us today. They have a plethora of youth engagement that's happening over there. And so if you want to get connected with them, please reach out to Gabriel. His information is also there and you can connect with him. Next slide. And then a little bit about myself and about DK. My name is Chantel. I'm a garden coordinator at GrowNYC. I started through an AmeriCorps service called Green City Forest. That's how I got introduced into urban agriculture. And I loved it. It was amazing. It transformed my life and helped me see community in a very different way. And so I'm happy to share all the knowledge that I've obtained with you all and really talk frankly about food justice. DK.
Hey y'all, I'm DK, AKA the friendly neighborhood farmer. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm hyped, I'm amped, I'm ready to just go right into it. So next slide, let's kick it off. Let's just get it going. So it's important before we start off that we just establish our zone. And in doing that, let's start off with a few community agreements. I have not a shadow of doubt that everybody joining us today has heard about community agreements in some form, way, or another. But for those that might be new to this term and new to this concept, let's talk about a few boundaries that not only do we hold ourselves accountable by, but we hold each other accountable by. I don't like to say rules, so I'll say boundaries. And the first boundary that we want to talk about to make sure that this is a liberated, safe, and inclusive space, the first thing that we want to all agree on, because everyone who showed up today, we're all agreeing to this by being in this space. And the first thing we've got to agree to is that respect comes first, point blank, period. We might not always agree. We might not always even like what's being said, but we must respect each other's right to say it. Chantel and I also subscribe to one mic. That just means let people talk. Try not to interrupt. Try not to be emotional, and try to respect the person that's actually speaking. Take space, make space. You're going to see today that Chantel and I have very large and robust personalities. We have no problem taking up space. But because we know that, sometimes we like to pass the mic and give others the chance to make space. We know everyone here has something to say, and whether you vocally say it today is different, but we know you have something to say. If you're one of those people that takes the mic to say something, absolutely say what you need, but be conscious that there might be some of those who might be a little shy and might need some encouragement, and use your platform to make space for that person. This is an important one. This is actually something that speaks to me all the time. Listen to understand and not to respond or retaliate. It's really important that we know that we're all here to learn and to grow. Nobody is in this forum to hurt feelings or offend. And today you might hear some things that might awake some trauma. You might hear some things that cause you to be deeply emotional, but know that wasn't the intention. And if you feel called to respond, take a moment to breathe and understand nobody here caused or meant to cause offense. Just take a moment and not just hear with your ears, but listen with your heart to what people are genuinely trying to say. We want to encourage you that this is a brave space. This is a safe space. And I'll add to that, because safety means different things to different people, this is a liberated space. And that just means everyone is welcome, because respect lives here. We really want to know which of these community agreements speaks to you. Chantel and I would also like to know which community agreements are you all perhaps using at your space at BroSis, or maybe are you using at home or in other spaces? I know we have some people in a room, we've got other people on the chat. Gabe, however you would like to moderate that, if people just want to shout it out or participate in the chat, we receive you however you're showing up. That also means if you don't feel called to participate in the chat or speak vocally and you want to email us later, we receive that too. So I'm going to toss it to Chantel to hear what she would like to say about community agreements. But while she's speaking, we would love to hear from you as well. What community agreements not only speak to you, and what should we add for this forum today? Chantel?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for, walking us through the community agreements. One thing I love to say is like, sorry. One thing I love to say is like, the community agreements are for all of us to agree on. And so if there are any community agreements that folks don't feel resonate with them, or they feel like we should add, I would love to, add any agreements that folks are already using. And just that also, maybe at one point I might, not subscribe to this community agreement. I want someone to say, hey, Chantel, one mic, right? Or, maybe DK, and I'll be like, hey, D, you gotta make space, right? And so let's all hold each other accountable to these community agreements today.
Next slide. So today we're going to talk about a lot of things, but we wanted to bring to your attention some key words and terms that maybe you've heard before, maybe you haven't, and that's fine. And some of those terms include gender bias, racial bias, and food justice. We're going to do a very deep dive involving all of those terms. And again, we want you to remember, this is an open forum. There's not going to be a test at the end. We're not going to call anybody out. We are simply here to learn and engage and hopefully learn something new. I want to point out something that my very esteemed colleague who's on this Zoom with us, Laura, pointed out a few workshops ago when she said, not only is every day a chance to learn something new, but every day is a great day to change your mind. So many of us might be walking into this with an idea or conception and then start to say, you know what? I didn't think about it that way. I think I want to change my mind. And we want to make sure that you have the agency to just do that. Chantel?
Yeah, I love that. So yeah, so we'll, we're not gonna like read through all of the vocabulary because we're gonna talk about it, right? So, bias, we'll talk about what that is. We'll talk about what's a favorable bias and what's an unfavorable bias. Next slide. And then we'll also talk about the ones that DK mentioned, gender bias, racial bias, as well as food justice. So let's just jump right into it. So why are we here today? So we're here today to talk about food as a human right, right? And so the reason why I love to bring up food as a human right is because a lot of times in our society, food isn't always seen as a human right. It's sometimes seen as a luxury or a privilege. And there are instances where people will have to go without food, And so when we say food is a human right, that means that we are throwing away all the systems. We are basically rebelling against every system that would make food a luxury or a privilege. And we're also unpacking narratives surrounding food and what it means to have access to food, to work with food, and ultimately to have a good relationship with food. And so that's a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is like, how does food connect to us as individuals, but also how does food connect to all of us as a society? Dee?
I love that. And I would just add, not only are we unpacking narratives, we're not just changing narratives, we're writing new narratives. Because a lot of the things that have been placed upon us in society, we didn't have a hand in communicating or creating. So it's our goal with this workshop to not only identify narratives, but to change them in ways that accurately reflect the communities that not only we're a part of, but that we serve. Next slide.
Love that. And so what is food justice, right? Food justice covers a lot of different topics. It covers transportation. It covers how long does it take for the food to get to you, right? Food access. How easy is it for you to get the food? Food quality. Do you like the food when you get it, right? Also cultural relevance. Like how is this tied to you and your family and things that you guys have experienced, right? And also money, right? Money is really important. So money or lack of money and job treatment and so much more. And so when we think about food, we usually only think about food in the terms of, well, I'm going to eat this food, but there's so much that is wrapped up in every individual thing that we're eating and we're consuming, right? So we're going to talk about why we think certain ways about food. We're going to talk about biases. And I know folks are probably like, I'm not biased. And that's okay to think that. But most of us have some form of bias, including myself. Right. And so we're gonna unpack a lot of that today and talk about some of those things that we might not have connected to food, but are actually really a big part of our experience.
Well, all right, let's do it. Next slide.
Right. And so what is a bias, right? So a bias is basically just a strong opinion, but it's not based on experience or logic. So for example, if you say you like apples more than oranges, but you never had an apple or orange, that would be considered a bias, right? And so a lot of times we have biases about things that we've never experienced. An instance I could think of now is I have a favorable bias about Bali. I think Bali is a beautiful country. Always wanted to go there. I've never been there. I know nothing about it, right? But that's just that's just my bias, right? And so a lot of us have biases. So we're going to unpack what it means to have a bias.
It's also important to note that just like in this picture, we've got the heart saying, hey, brain, look over here, look at this. And the brain is saying, no, I'm too busy. I'm too busy focusing on the bad. And I just want to take a moment to call that out, because in everyday life, it can be very easy to get caught up in focusing on the bad. Social media, entertainment, sports, music, politics. It can be very easy to get caught up in what we're hearing and what we're seeing, but not necessarily what we are experiencing to know to be true. So it's important that we take time to kind of unplug from that overstimulation and those things that could be very negatively impacting us and preventing us from really seeing that not only do we have biases, but what they are. Next slide.
Yes, I love that. And so a bias can be favorable or unfavorable, right? So in the instance of me talking about Bali, it's really great for the tourist person who's like trying to get me to buy a ticket that I have this favorable bias, right? In reference to it. And so sometimes when we think about biases, we tend to think about very negative things. But in some cases, a bias can have a favorable outcome. For instance, in this slide, we talk about, your teacher thinking that girls are smarter, which I believe for a long time, my own personal bias, but your teacher thinking girls are smarter and you getting a higher grade because of that, right? But it's unfavorable for the person who doesn't identify it that way and them getting a lower grade, right? And so while some biases can be unfavorable, some of them can be favorable, right? But we do want to highlight that a lot of biases actually feed into stereotypes. And in a part of learning about biases, we can start to disprove those biases and start to negate some of those stereotypes that would negatively impact others.
Well said. It's important to remember as well that biases don't just affect us as the individual. Biases affect entire communities. And that's because a bias is a gateway to a stereotype. And a stereotype is something that is not only passed down generationally, but can take decades to dismantle and change. So it's important to say, well, it's just my small bias. There's never a thing as a small bias. Well, it's just something I say around family and friends. Still not good, and still something that's going to affect the larger community for decades to come. Next slide. We have a slide here to talk about our first bias, and that is gender bias. As I'm talking and you're looking at this image, we want to know, how is this picture landing for you? Gender bias is the tendency to prefer one gender over another. And as Chantel shared, it can be a teacher thinking that girls are smarter than boys. Not necessarily because that teacher has experienced that, but that's something internal that the teacher is carrying and now projecting out into the community. As you're looking at this image, we're curious to know, what do you think is happening here? What images are coming up for you? How is this landing for you? I never like saying, how does it make you feel? But to be honest, we want to know. Can you relate? Have you experienced this? Are you indifferent? Do you care? What are some things that you can think of in your mind that are coming up for you? And we'll get to those responses in a second. Next slide. As you're thinking about what's coming up for you and what's landing, again, what do you identify from this picture? Which character do you identify with and why? Do you even identify with either one of these characters. And that's important because when Chantel and I were preparing for this presentation, we put two images of the traditional US, maybe even American, cis female and cis male. But maybe some in this group don't identify with this image at all. And if that's the case, that's okay. Share with us, has bias ever affected you and how? And if the answer is it hasn't yet, that's all right too. How do you think gender or gender bias has played a role in relationships with food? So for those who might be saying, what the heck is this woman talking about? Let me give you an example. In my family, most of the males know how to cook. And when we were growing up, it was as if a man knowing how to cook was less than being male. It was as if a man know how to cook, maybe there were some not so nice words or feminine centered words hurled at them because they simply knew how to cook. Yet the interesting part of that is that in today's society, the majority of the people in the restaurant industry that are chefs and cooks are male. So they had to have learned from somewhere. So a gender bias towards my family would be that cooking is women's work and that the man has no place in the kitchen. I'm going to pause for a second and I'm going to pass the mic. Share with us in the chat or vocally, Gabe, in your classroom. Tell us some things that are biases, gender bias, that maybe you've experienced or even that you've witnessed. How about you, Chantel?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. And I think for me, it was similar, like where, you know, I'm very young and I'm learning how to cook from my mother and her rationale as well. You're a woman, so you need to know how to cook if you want to like get a husband, right? And so like, I'm 12, I don't want a husband. I also don't want to cook. Like I want to like go out with my friends, right? And so kind of being like forced into this kind of pigeonhole where it's like you have to cook, and then later on being like an adult and actually knowing how to cook and like completely like rebelling against that and being like, I'm not going to cook for no man, like starve, eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? And it's like two very like extremes, but like both of them wrapped up in my gender and like my relationship to food.
Thank you for sharing that. What's interesting today is, oh, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry, DK, we have one here.
Great.
I just wanted to say that I totally agree with that. My mom was always like, "Oh, Elia, learn how to cook, because when you grow up, you're gonna have a husband." But I'm pretty bad at cooking, so it's just like I don't really know if I should really be focused on that or like if he would even like my food to begin with. But another thing I noticed about gender and like gender bias in terms of food is that some people believe that because of your gender, you should have a specific portion size, whether it's more or less than the other gender. So I feel like that's also a big part of gender bias that has been like shown throughout like history or throughout the media, which is totally like incorrect to say.
Yes, I love that. I love that. No one has mentioned that before, the portion size, but that's so true. If I get an extra helping, it's like, oh, like you still hungry? And it's like, yes, I'm still hungry. I can't, like, I'm gonna eat. You know what I mean? And my gender shouldn't factor into the level of consumption, you know. I love that point.
Me too. I'm so glad that you said that. Thank you for that share. I want to make space and make room for anyone else. Okay, we're gonna keep moving along. But keep in mind, we understand that what we're talking about today is not easy. And what we're talking about today, honestly, some of us might not want to deal with today. And we respect that. We understand that many of these topics might awake some trauma that we've worked so hard to suppress, or maybe tap us on the shoulder about trauma we didn't even know that we had. So it's important to realize that as we're talking about these things, it's okay if you don't want to jump up right now. The conversation doesn't end here. And hopefully these will be things that everyone continues to talk about in a variety of spaces. Our next bias is another really big one. It's racial bias. Racial biases are the feelings or attitudes of other people based on their race. More specifically, racial biases often occur simply based off of how one individual might look. Our racial biases are often conceived off of physical characteristics that are then transitioned into social mindsets. So I'm gonna lean into that example that was shared. As a woman of a certain height and physical characteristics, I might be perceived very negatively because of my height and body type. And to take it a step further, my height and body type may be unfairly characterized across all cis Black women. And it might be perceived socially that maybe I don't have the intelligence, the manners, or the culture to succeed in this America. And that all stems from how I look physically and the traits that I inherited genetically from my family. Start to think about, if you've experienced them, what are some times that you've experienced racial bias? What are some times that maybe you've witnessed racial bias? And to do that, take a look at this image. What do you think is happening here? And how do you think racial bias is tapping into that? I want to go ahead to the next slide, but I do want to give people a chance to digest what this image is bringing up for you. Chantel?
Yeah, let's go to the next slide, Laura. And so when we talk about racial bias, we know that it's a heavy topic, like DK said, right? And so we are going to be very sensitive in having these conversations, and this is where our community agreements are going to kick in, right? And so just think about, like, what do you identify from this picture? Can you identify with any of the characters, and why, right? If this bias has ever affected you or affected someone you know, or something similar to this has ever affected you. And also, how do you think race and racial bias plays into your relationship with food? And so I want to give some space for folks to digest that, but then also offer up my own experience of, being a Black woman, right? And, not eating meat, and other people being like, well, you're Black, you should be eating some chicken, and you need, oxtails, and you need all of this stuff. And these are things that I've experienced growing up in my life, but not necessarily things that I am consuming now. But because of my race, when people automatically meet me, they think, oh yeah, you definitely want this chicken sandwich, right? And I'm like, wait, no, I don't actually, and so that has been very interesting, navigating that with the outside world, because they have a specific perception of me, and a specific perception of what it is that I like or what it is that I am going to subscribe to or be, curry favor with. See?
Thank you for sharing that. I'm listening to receive what you're saying, and I'm becoming a little emotional because I'm thinking about the spaces that I've shown up for events, and it was perceived that to be culturally inclusive, what needed to be served was chicken and waffles. And it was as if, because of my race, and because chicken and waffles are very good and prevalent in my race and culture, it was as if that was defining me, as if that was all I could eat, or that was the only thing I knew about. And it was based off of my race. And to be honest, it hurt. And to be in this forum now to talk about it, I'm thinking like, dang, that's what people really see. They don't see anything beyond my color or my gender. It hurts when they don't give you a chance to speak your truth or speak your intelligence solely based off of how you look. I would love to hear what everybody else is thinking. We would love to know, how do you identify with this image, or do you even at all? Which side do you identify with, if you identify with the side? And it's important that I remind everyone, let's all respect each other's answers. It is okay if you identify with the side that maybe might not be seen as popular. And it's okay if you identify with that side because that's what you were taught, or that's what you grew up with. How have racial biases affected you or affected someone you know? And how does racial bias play into your relationship with food?
Yeah. Okay, you guys can unmute if someone else has something to say. Got a raised hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I've noticed a lot of negative stereotypes around foods and specific races we were talking about. And something that this topic of food justice that reminded me of is what I was learning in school, where we were talking about how communities that are poor, or sometimes communities that have people of color, like mainly in it, there's a lot of fast food restaurants in those communities. And I think this kind of like relates to systemic racism, because these communities are usually like poor, and that's because people of color are like paid less than white people themselves. And these fast food restaurants, they're cheap, they're easy to get, they're like fast food, obviously. So they put these chains in these communities so that these people can, buy that fast food, but that fast food is generally like unhealthy and just like, yeah, unhealthy for you in general. And that kind of goes with like food quality, and how some people don't have like good food quality because they don't have the money for it, or if they do have the money for it, they're spending that money on other stuff that they need, such as like health care for themselves and their family. So I think that really relates to like race and the whole food quality, food access, and just like it stems from this like idea of just racism in our society in general.
Well said.
I can also, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I can also relate to that. I'm also vegetarian. I've been vegetarian for maybe 4 years now. And I remember the first like Black vegetarian person I met, I was like, wow, Black people can be vegetarian. And I remember thinking like I sound ridiculous, but growing up in the South, it was like all we ate was meat. It was like when you had dinner, it was like 3 different kinds of meat and you kind of packed it on. And when I became vegetarian, it was a lot of me having to go to supermarkets that I wasn't used to going to, or if I wanted to just get a quick bite to eat, I'd have to go to Manhattan. And people would say, "Oh, you're eating white people food." And I'm like, it's very hard to find affordable vegetarian options in the Bronx as someone who's low income. Um, and so that's just been a big way that race has played into how, like, my relationship with food is like, if I want to eat the way that I want to eat, like if I want to be vegetarian or have healthier options, it's I have to go through more means than somebody else in a different community would, and then how I'm perceived because of that. Like, some people like to second guess your blackness if you don't eat meat, and it becomes a larger conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That is, I can relate with that so much. And I also want to highlight what the other person said about racism, systemic racism playing a role in just having access to food, right? And so it's like, because there is a perception of, okay, this is what people can afford, or this is what people are allowed to eat, or this is what people are culturally eating, that limits us, right? As a group, and then also as individuals, from being able to break those barriers and actually have healthier options, and actually talk about why, hey, I'm eating this, stir fry. Why is that better than that like pork sandwich that you're eating right now, right? Or like, maybe you need to eat this with that sandwich that you're eating, right? And like having those conversations, and not making it where it's either or.
I love that. I love everybody's shares. And I again want to thank everyone for being so transparent and for being so giving, because not only are these topics not easy to talk about, they're especially not easy to talk about when we have never met each other and when we don't know each other. So thank you so much for your share. I also want to make it clear that there is nothing wrong with meat if that's how you get down. There's nothing wrong with your perhaps food of choice that is also very much tied to your upbringing and your culture. But it's just important to know that those choices should never be based off of how you look and your race. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that ties into what we're talking about when we talk about the stereotypes of certain stores that tend to be more readily found in low-income neighborhoods. I live in Washington Heights. I'm not ashamed or embarrassed to say, yeah, there's a lot of chicken places in my neighborhood. There's a lot of alcohol places in my neighborhood. And when we talk about that, we lead into this next slide that talks about another really important bias, and that's environmental bias. When we have circumstances that prevent us from not only having access to fresh, affordable food that we choose to eat, but we talk about also not having the land and space to not only grow those things, but the agency to be able to grow and sustain for ourselves. When we think about Flint, Michigan, Jackson, Mississippi, when we think about Camden, New Jersey, and Newark, New Jersey, that are plagued with environmental systemic issues of water pollution, contamination in the soil and land, noise pollution, and so many other things that affect our ability to work in tandem with the land to grow and sustain for ourselves. Now we're talking about environmental biases. One of the things that was mentioned was we tend to see a certain type of store in our neighborhoods. That's called redlining. So perhaps we've heard about redlining when it comes to our homes, but we don't often talk about supermarket redlining. And that is to say, when we might find certain supermarkets in more affluent communities versus the more low-income ones. And believe it or not, that supermarket redlining is also tied to environmental bias. When we look at this image, we have one character saying, "There's no food anywhere." And then we have someone in a business suit saying, "Sorry, kid, it was the cost of business." What does this image evoke for you? Can you identify with this picture at all? If you can, which character can you identify with? Now, when I say identify, I don't mean which character are you. I mean, which character have you seen, have you experienced, and why? And how does this image of environmental justice, how does this land and speak with you? Chantel, kick us off with an example, please.
Oh yeah, thank you. And I think that this is so important to talk about, because I think a lot of times when we talk about, you know, food justice, or we talk about food apartheid or supermarket redlining, or a lot of the issues that we're talking about, we kind of miss the land piece. We kind of miss the environmental and nature piece of it. And so, you know, just looking at the picture that we have here, we have both characters that are like barefoot, kind of looking crazy, right? And it's like one of them was actually benefiting from all of the destruction that was happening, and the other one is so young that they don't actually have the means to create meaningful impact. And I think a lot of us are dealing with that. We're in society, we're in communities and in society where we feel like, you know, there are all these things that have already transpired, and now I'm sitting in the middle of it. And what can I do but look around for something that's going to sustain me and something that's going to help me?
Thank you for saying that. I want to also bring up some additional terms that might come up for everyone as we're looking at this slide. Maybe some of us have heard the term food desert and food apartheid. Chantel and I work very hard to distinguish the difference and educate the communities that we serve. We don't live in food deserts. We live in food insecure communities that are struggling through food apartheid. That's just a lot of fancy talk. That means a desert is not man-made. A desert is natural. But food insecurity is man-made. That's something that we as people can do something about. When we talk about food apartheid, which is a term that was coined by the very prolific food activist Karen Washington, not only are we talking about that everyone has the right to food, that food isn't a privilege. When we talk about food apartheid, and now another term, food sovereignty, we talk about that everybody has the right to have a say at the table. A right to say what we're growing, how we're growing it, how we produce it, how we consume it, and so forth. So when we look at this example of environmental justice, it's important to recognize terms that are being thrown around. And I say that because we're not just changing narratives, we're writing new narratives. And when we write new narratives, language counts. Gabe, we'd love to hear from you all in the room. Okay. Oh, yes, please.
I'm sorry, I feel like most people, I like most places, like the Bronx, they have like, what you call it, food deserts, like places on Harlem too. That they're not able to like get access to their food, which is mostly like junk food, you know, other stuff. So it's not like it's not simple to other people, especially older people. That's how most people get diabetes. Because they're so grown up with junk food, that they don't really have options to get healthy options.
Were you able to hear me okay?
It was a little hard to hear everything that was said.
I'll repeat myself again. I feel like okay. I'll repeat myself what I said again. I feel like most food places, like food deserts, happen in mostly like old Harlem or like upper Bronx, you know, because most of them are like unhealthy and have McDonald's everywhere. And elders, this is how elders get sick because there are no really good diets. It's causing them to get diabetes and other health issues.
Yeah, that was a great point.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I recently saw online that there was this story or headline about how Alaska was like closing their snow crab leg season, I believe, or where they like sell snow crab legs and for people to eat, obviously. And I think that really relates to this image because you see a lot of stories about how people dump oil into the ocean and how it's just so polluted with just garbage because these companies just don't really care about the environment and mainly care about money because people are very selfish and money is like the main thing that they really want to achieve, so they'll do whatever they want to get money. So you kind of see that with like the stop of the snow crab legs being sold, how this destroying of like the environment, how that can affect like the food because snow crab legs are no longer being sold. And if this is happening to just one like certain group of food like crabs, imagine what's going to happen in the future when the oceans are even more polluted because we don't really see companies stopping or like people stopping from polluting the ocean. So kind of like wonder if this is already happening now, what's going to happen in the future when things get even worse.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and I think, a lot of times, and that really relates to this image as well, a lot of times we think that things are, secular, right? So it's like, oh, I'm selling this, and it doesn't really matter where it came from or how I got it or who I impact. All that really matters is like how much money I'm getting. And then that's actually not the reality because it's not a sustainable system, right? And so we see a lot of organizations and companies and even individual people who will put profits over the environment, over people's safety, over people's health, just over life in general. And so it is going to continue to have a negative impact as long as we continue to allow it to happen. And as long as we continue to buy into products and companies and organizations that don't put people over profit.
Very well said. It's also a nod to the direction that we're going in and what happens when we don't have community green spaces, when we don't have community gardens for residents and partners to be able to grow food for themselves. The gentleman mentioned diabetes, hypertension. My family lives in Harlem. I live in Washington Heights. And when we don't have viable spaces like community gardens to not only reverse some of the things that are going on in this image, we don't have settings to not only grow our own food to limit those health conditions, but we don't have the conversational spaces to talk about diabetes, hypertension, and so many other illnesses being food conditions and not things that are genetic. We don't have opportunities for educational opportunities. And so often we have communities that think that diabetes and hypertension is going to be passed down, and it's not. It's something that we can actually do something about. So thankfully, we have these virtual opportunities to connect with a BroSis, to connect with an NYBG, to connect with a Kelly Street Garden, to talk about these things. But when we don't have green spaces, again, it's affecting all community, not just one-off individuals. Let's go ahead to the next slide, please. So as we wrap up this portion about environmental bias and our other biases as well, this is a slide that speaks to Chantel and I very, very much. As land stewards, there are images here that evoke a lot for us because we're on the land every single day. This image, we're curious to know from you, like the other images, can you identify to this image? And if you do, what are you identifying to? Do you know land workers? Do you know producers? Because it's not just about being on the land, that is but one piece. Do you know producers that work in distribution factories or pantries or other places like restaurants where food is handled and managed? What does the skull and crossbones represent for you that's in the right corner? And how do you think this relates to food justice?
For me, just seeing the skull and bones, I'm thinking like when people are using certain products or maybe like pesticides or things to boost, food production, but in the long run are more damaging and harmful for the earth or for the wildlife in the area, um, which is, it's being done more so for profit because actual food justice is making sure that the earth is okay and that the food is okay going into people's systems, not just trying to mass produce it. Um, that's what's going through my mind.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, I was also saying like the skull and the crossbones probably represent the pesticides being used for their farming. Yeah, for the distribution.
Yeah, really great points. And I think those are some important things to like talk through, because I think a lot of times when we think about, agriculture, we might be like, yeah, the revolutionary farmer that's trying to save the earth, right? And then there are other folks who are farming not for the sake of providing food for community, but for the sake of having, $1 million, $1 billion farm enterprise, for the sake of owning 40 acres or 60 acres across a certain place, or for the sake of being able to renovate land or take advantage of certain tax codes that are, provided for farmers. And so, at the same time that we're holding corporations and individuals and organizations to standards about, their impact when it comes to the land, we also have to hold farmers to that same standard as well.
It also evokes that, for me, this image is an image that looks like me. So it evokes two things. It evokes creating new narratives that farm work and agriculture is a respectable trade. It's not necessarily tied to a lack of education or low income. it also evokes for me, and Chantel, jump in here with my numbers, please, that we're living at a time when previously Black, and I'll even throw Latino landowners in there, owned maybe 14 to 20% of the land in this country. And we have now been shamefully reduced to between maybe 1% and 3% of land ownership. So we're still behind the 8 ball. We're still in spaces that maybe are not healthy for us to produce this food. And we're still not given the agency to produce it on our own land. So that's just something I wanted to throw out. Next slide, please. Let's do a check-in. Before we go to the next activity, I want to just encourage everybody to just take a moment to breathe, because we're talking about a lot, and we're talking about things that are not fun or popular and just bring up a lot of emotion, or again, trauma, or even uncomfortableness. You know, Chantel and I are dedicated to I don't even want to call it work. I'm going to say we're dedicated to the purpose and calling that we have of educating communities about food justice, but it's not easy work and it's not light. So before we go in to check our biases, I just want to take 30 seconds, myself included, for everyone to just be quiet and just breathe and just connect with how you're feeling. I just want to check in to just make sure that everyone is okay. And if you would like to share something in the chat or vocally that's speaking to you, by all means, please do. The conversation doesn't stop here. If you're not able to express, that's fine. But I just want to make sure that we're all doing okay. So let's just take 30 seconds to just breathe. And then Chantel, when we're done, please kick us off with the next portion.
Yeah, awesome. I'm gonna do a little stretch too, because I'm sitting down, so I wanna. Okay, good. Awesome. Yeah, sometimes you gotta just release it. Whatever is trapped, you gotta just release it and just let it go. Well, I promise you'll feel better. But now we're gonna jump into my favorite activity ever. It's called Check Your Bias, right? And I know we all don't have biases. We're all unbiased in this room, but we're going to, just have this activity so we can kind of talk through some biases that come up as we were talking about food insecurity and also food justice efforts. And so since we do have folks that are in like one central room, as the slides come up, feel free to shout out true or false. Gabe, I am going to ask you to unmute. It's going to be a little crazy, but that's okay because I want everyone to be heard. And so the bias statements are going to come up. Disclaimer, these statements are biased. That's all I'm going to say, right? And so you're going to say whether you believe the statement is true or false. There is no right or wrong answer. There is only a degree of different perspectives and opinions. And so this is another space where our community agreements are going to be full effect, right? And so I want to jump right into this. But Gabe, I am going to ask you to unmute folks first before we jump into the bias statements. Okay, awesome. So let's go to our next slide. All right, so our first bias statement. People don't have access to fresh produce because they don't ask for it in their communities. True or false? So you can say it out loud and you can also write in the chat, true or false. Okay, some falses.
False.
Okay, I heard some truths. Okay,
All answers are acceptable. Nobody's wrong. It's just a matter of perception, and that's okay. Okay, I'm seeing in the chat false. I'm seeing both. Okay.
okay, we got some more falses. Okay, okay.
Chantella, I think we woke up, bro, sis.
I think we did.
I think it's starting to get hot.
And so I would love for someone to talk about why they said true. And then I would also love for someone to talk about why they said false for this.
Eduardo said false.
Yeah.
Eduardo, explain.
I said false because
Uh-huh.
there are a bunch of gardens and they always ask for more healthier stuff. In fact, Food Empowerment did an activity where we went around to count how many delis there were compared to supermarkets, and the ratio was extremely low for supermarkets.
Mm.
Food Empowerment is a group that he's part of here, just for clarity.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Food Empowerment is a group that he's a part of here at BroSis, just for clarity.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, awesome. So you're saying false because you guys went around and you guys surveyed the community and people were asking for it in the community. And for someone who said true, does anyone want to, we also have people here virtual, so if anyone wants to raise their hand or anyone in the room want to say why they said that this was true.
I said people have lack of communication, so that's why it's false, because that's why they don't have fresh produce. Because lack of communication causes less fresh produce. Oh, yeah.
Okay, I hear you. Oh, you guys muted for a second.
Wait, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you.
Folks, wait.
Or do people like give those sources?
So wait, there's a question of clarity.
That information that you have.
Yeah, Angie, were you responding to the false or the true?
Yes, because of lack of information, we don't really know where to get our fresh produce.
As a result of it being false.
Yes.
Right, okay. So Angie was responding to the false.
Okay, great.
Okay.
All right, awesome. Do we have anyone else that wants to say something before we move on to the next bias statement?
Okay, so I'm gonna jump in.
Okay.
Of the two of us, of the unpopular opinion advocate, I'm gonna wear that hat today, and I'm gonna say this statement is true because closed mouths don't get fed, and if people would speak up, they would have access. Well, maybe people are speaking up, and maybe they're not being heard. Maybe people are speaking up, and what they're asking for is not seen or understood as culturally relevant. Maybe who they're asking doesn't understand based off of how they grew up, so they don't think it's important. Maybe who they're asking has power or control and is making the decision, nope, that's going to cost too much. It's going to affect my bottom line of my budget. So no. So it's important to understand that people are asking, but it's not always received. And I say that because appearance is everything. You might walk into your local market and say, you know, hey, nobody's standing up for this, but maybe they are. And we're not able to see it because those people who are standing up are not being received and heard. I want to acknowledge in the chat that Janaya says, maybe it is also more profitable to have fast food, yes, than it is surplus of fresh produce. That is 100% right. Thank you so much for sharing that. You are absolutely right. We all know that the dollar speaks. And in a lot of circles, the dollar is king. So it might not be profitable, and a certain narrative or agenda might more so be pushed than that healthy narrative of food that is healthy for us. Next slide, please. Chantel, take it away.
Second bias statement. Also want to thank everyone because this is always gets spicy when we talk about the bias statement. So this is very in line. Second bias statement, if people manage their money effectively, they would be able to afford better food. True or false? Okay, we got some truth, we got some falses.
It's getting hot. It's getting hot in here. It's getting hot.
What? Inflation. Okay.
Yes, that's true. Inflation. You're right.
Okay, Ronald, speak up.
I know it's true.
So the last person that said true, tell us why you said true, please.
No, she's always just saying something.
Who said true?
I said false. I said false.
No, you didn't.
If people manage their money, they'll be afford better food. I mean, like, if you rationed enough money to get better food, you know, there could get better food, you know? Like, you know, like to save some money for better food. What if you have this? I'm saying that's why I'm rationing, like rational money.
You ration food, not money.
You can ration both.
You ration both, correct. You ration both.
Exactly.
You want to say something, Eduardo?
I just thought that's how you use the word is my fault.
Say that one more time. You thought what?
Yeah, we got one more. I feel like that's false though, because like, what if, the nearest, the nearest better, okay, like, what if the nearest source of better food is like in another neighborhood or something? Like fresh grocery stores or whatever in the neighborhood? And you have to like, or to get to, fresh food or whatever.
Nice, make the effort.
Yeah, but
Mhm.
you have to pay for
Take public transportation.
Okay, wait, folks, one mic, remember? Did you folks hear that, DK and Chantel?
I heard a lot of talking, but only caught snippets.
So, Salma, nice and loud, but come a little closer.
I feel like the statement is false because like, even if you do manage your money effectively, like if the better food or whatever is in like a different neighborhood, then you still have to like pay more money. And you have to put more effort into trying to get that.
That's very true. That's very true.
Yeah. So
Oh, please go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I love that point because it talks about access, right? And we were talking about how that's a big part of food justice, right? And so it's like, yeah, I can have all the money in the world, but if it takes me 2 hours to get to the better grocery store and I have mobility issues, or I have, or I need someone to come with me, right? Or I can't take the bus, or there's no train that goes there, or I have to walk there, or, you know, I don't have the time because I'm working, right? That is going to limit my ability to actually be able to get that food, right? Dee?
That's true. And coming from a space of personal experience, when my mother was alive, she was a beast at money management. But the reality was that she was a single parent trying to raise my sister and I off of her low income salary. She was also trying to raise me, who had an abundance and still has an abundance, and not in a good way. So I guess I should switch out that word and say plethora of allergies, illnesses, and asthma. So my mom was often in a position where she had to think about food to feed us so that we wouldn't be hungry, but she had to think about what she was feeding me was making me physically sick. So she was caught between what they say a rock and a hard place, because do I feed my daughter so she cannot go to bed hungry? Or do I feed her what I know is going to land us in the hospital or the doctor's office, and now I need money for medicine? So it wasn't that she was mismanaging money. My mom was dope at managing money, but she was caught in a very difficult position with even her managing money. She didn't have access because of transportation and other factors that would allow us to effectively buy with the money that she had.
I also want to highlight, Arabatu said something in the chat, said, I don't agree with that because many federal agencies give a high level of governing power to big ag corporations to choice their prices due to competitive pricing, where we don't even choose our grower, climate change, and low wages to farmers, growers, just to keep prices fair. And I think that there is some validity to that statement, because there are some federal programs that will say, well, you can't price this bunch of collard greens above this level, right? Because then it would be too high and people wouldn't be able to afford it. I think we also need to factor in the fact that in a lot of low income communities, food actually costs more money than when you go out to other affluent supermarkets and neighborhoods, right? And so although there is this big push for prices to be fair, whatever fair is, right? Because fair is also subjective to what the person can pay for. There is also some places that are not abiding by that and continue to raise their prices and continue to make it harder for people to be able to purchase food. And we have a hand raised, so I want to give space for you to also say something, Janaya.
It was just a quick comment. I also think it's false, because if I walk into a store and I'm looking for something healthy, like most delis won't even have any fruit. They if you ask for a salad, they'll it's like $8. I could get like 3 slices of pizza and a drink and some French fries, and then still have, money left over that's under $8. And often spaces just don't cultivate to that. Like when I started college, I was working like 3 jobs, so I always had money. And even in my college cafeteria, which has thousands of students, if I wanted something vegetarian, I had rice, I had French fries, and that was pretty much my whole first semester when I went to school. It's like if I wanted to eat something that was like healthier, it was smaller things, and they were often the same price as, if I were to go to like a chicken spot and get an entire meal.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for saying that. I also want to uplift, it's important to understand we're not food shaming anyone, but we are talking about what is both healthy and culturally relevant. And I say that to say I steward with an amazing farmer and mentor who, when she first came to this country, what the American standard was for healthy was physically making her sick. And it became important to provide her the green space to plant things that were culturally relevant and would make her physically well. So our goal is not to food shame anyone, but it is to recognize what might be healthy in one area might be very different from another, but it's just important that we all have the agency and seat at the table to have access to what is going to work for us. Next slide, please. Take it
Nice.
away, Chantel.
Yes. Third bias statement. The supermarkets in Black and brown communities don't offer quality produce. True or false?
True.
Got a lot of truth. We got some boths. Okay.
Yeah. What's true?
Okay. Does anybody want to say why they feel like this is true?
Food in like the supermarkets expire like faster than like the quality produce that you see in like farmer markets. What?
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay. You also had some folks.
I mean, they're not really, like, all like the food products are not really built for like colored people in general. It's like mostly for like people that we're like stereotype, oh, we eat junk food, we eat watermelon, we eat chicken and stuff. And all the white people eat the healthy things, you know? That's what my opinion. Somebody talk, Michaela?
I mean, some of the supermarkets in Black and brown communities don't offer quality food. Well, it depends on.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I said, I said that it depends on which produce you get. Like, there's a lot of options that you could choose from, but it doesn't depend on like the community. But also, it depends on
That's
Okay.
very true. I would agree with that.
Mhm.
And it also depends on, to piggyback on that, it depends on what your standard is. You know, I recently saw someone fishing in the Harlem River. I wouldn't be out there, but I'm not to say that the person who is trying to feed their family, that isn't right for them. And I say that because maybe that person's country of origin, maybe they've experienced water systems that are a lot worse. So this is a difficult statement because I do agree that a lot of low income Black and Latino and other communities don't offer quality produce, but again, it's subjective. So we have an instance here where true and false could both be right.
Yeah, because I think also this statement doesn't talk about the fact that not all Black and brown communities are low income communities, right? And
Right.
so there are very affluent Black and brown communities that do have access to quality produce, right? And so this bias statement is generalizing and saying all Black and brown people are low income and all of them don't have access to quality produce. Not factoring the fact that also not everybody gets their produce from supermarkets, right? Some people are going to food pantries, some people are going to food co-ops, some people are going to, you know, the lady on the corner who's selling, you know, vegetables. And so there are different ways that you can also get access to quality produce outside of going into a supermarket. Yes. All right. Next slide. So our last bias statement, the spiciest one yet, people who use SNAP/EBT, formerly known as food stamps, don't buy healthy food. True.
False.
True. Very much I am a Sam's member, and I do not like.
I don't really know. I know my mom buys stuff.
Wait, it depends, cause.
Wait, who wants to speak up? Speak
Yeah,
up.
who wants to say why they picked true or false?
Come closer. Speak
That's
up.
so, can I just speak up here?
No, yeah, project. We gotta say it. Project. BroSis, one mic.
I think it's false because it kind of actually just depends on the circumstances. Like for some people, they'll just give it to like for example, I remember when I had like EBT, my mom would just send me to the supermarket and I'll get like some Doritos or something with other groceries that she wanted. But also there's like in food markets, they have like these deals that you can get with EBT cards that like it allows you to also make healthier choices. Because I know they have like deals where if you use EBT, you can get health bucks back. So that could like help people make the right choice to have healthier food. So it really just depends mostly. I agree.
Okay, awesome. We also have someone in the chat that said, Janaya said false. When my neighborhood, they accept food stamps at the GrowNYC farmers market. I know many people who were rejoicing because they finally had local access in my neighborhood, which is low income. Yeah, and I love to bring up this bias statement because I like to dispel the narrative of the propaganda of the welfare queen, right? The person who's like has all the food stamps and like they're not using it, they're not buying food with it, right? But then also just because a lot of people generally think this way or think that because someone has governmental assistance, that they're not necessarily eating healthy or that they're not, prioritizing their health in the right way. And so, having these conversations about, these biases really do help to create new narratives, as DK was saying earlier.
Mhm. This statement is also quite judgy. And it judges us in a way that doesn't give grace to mental and emotional health. Maybe when you saw Chantel and I on the supermarket line and we had cake and ice cream, maybe that was the one time we didn't have something that was deemed healthy. And maybe we had cake and ice cream because it was a time of celebration, or maybe mentally or emotionally, we just had a bad day. Maybe as human beings, we just needed something to lift our spirits. And this bias, not only, it just is what it is, but it just judges us in a way that doesn't extend grace or even humanity.
Yeah, I love that. And so let's roll because we're coming up, and so I want us to be able to check in about our bias, about the bias statements that we reviewed, and everything else that we talked about. And just to give a disclaimer that regardless of whether you thought that the statement was true or false, there are really no wrong answers, only a variety of opinions and perspectives. And I say that because, some of us felt true, some of us felt false, some of us felt both, some of us felt like, who came up with these bias statements, right? Let's not talk about that right now. But what we're talking about is the fact that, we are all allowed to, have this human experience, and we all might feel differently about the same thing. I also want to uplift Shania in the chat. There's also a situation of the time that buying fresh food takes to prepare. People who work a lot with a lot of responsibility don't have the time to prepare fresh foods. So they buy what's best for their circumstance. And that's so true too, right? You just came off of work, or you just came out of school, you're really tired, you have a whole bunch of homework. Like, do you really want to sit down and peel a whole bunch of potatoes and try to make potato soup, right? Probably not, right? It might be easier to just go to the store or go somewhere and get something that's convenient and that's going to fit your lifestyle. And so, you know, those are some of the things that we do have to navigate as well in our relationship to food. So let's jump to the next slide, which is basically what is food justice, what we've been talking about this whole time, right? And so food justice recognizes healthy food as a human right. It addresses not only what food we are eating, but how it gets to us, from farmers to food workers to consumers. Food justice says that we all deserve good quality of life and access to healthy food. And we will also be sharing the presentation. It has like a whole bunch of slides on things that you can do if you want to, like, you know, continue on championing for food justice or just have conversations about food justice with your friends and your family. Different farms that you can visit. If you guys haven't been like on a big farm, where you want to see what other farmers are doing and how they're helping to combat food injustices that are happening. And then also like other organizations that are kind of in the mix and doing their own respective programs that you could probably get connected to.
We also want to uplift BroSis, because we know that y'all are doing your part to fight food insecurity. I've been to your garden and it's amazing. And I can't wait to come back with Chantel and Laura. So effective immediately. Going into the next presentation, we're adding BroSis to this list, and we're going to continue to talk about, you know, everything that y'all are doing in this food justice mission with us, and we thank you for that.
BroSis is actually here.
Thank you guys so much. We appreciate you all so much. There is a survey that you all could take. Like I said, we'll send out the presentation and you could just scan it on your phone. It's like 3 questions, just so we can see, you know, how you guys felt about the presentation, how you felt about the workshop, and we can, you know, curate it so it can be better in the future. So we just appreciate everyone for being present and available and open, sharing. That's what made this, you know, a really great experience. So I just appreciate you all. I just want to express that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank y'all. Keep talking, keep growing, keep teaching. Don't be afraid to change your mind. Don't be afraid to have these hard conversations. Know that Chantel and I are here to have these conversations with you, and to change everything, we need everyone. So we uplift you. We thank you for all that y'all are contributing to make this a more food sovereign space. So absolutely, thank you.
Okay, Lila, you want to take us home?
Yeah. But I'll just leave myself because or no, I'll end it for all. Didn't 2 of you say you wanted to keep talking? I think you better call each
Oh,
other
no.
separately.
Yeah, we were talking.
And end the meeting for everyone. Thank you again, everyone. Have a good night.
All right,
Bye.
good night.